extend a welcome to our second half of our day, tackling art, personhood, and the origins of art therapy here at Hull-House. Our first speaker for this part of the day is Jennifer Civita. She's the Department Chair of Art Therapy at Adler University. We're going to hear from her, and we're going to hear from a panel of art therapists, social workers, and also do an activity together to get our energy flowing and really experience kind of what art therapy can do with being a directly part of the arts. But first, let me introduce Jennifer. Jennifer Civita is the Department Chair in Counseling of Art Therapy at Adler University. She's a fourth-generation Chicagoan, and her interests include art therapy, social interest, kinetic learning styles, community engagement through the arts, and arts administration, and arts making. So she's a really great person to infuse us with this conversation today. She's published in the following letters from the Executive Director, which is Portage Parks, Arts of Annual Publication. She's also published in Portage Park Center for the Arts, What an Art and Wellness Center Can Do for You, as well as Arts and Community Revitalization, which is a part of the Old Living Park Association Network publication, and the Arts and Arts Organization and Arts Markets Reports and Urban Revitalization in the Arts. He's also a practitioner who practices complementary with alternative modes in holistic healing, with specialization, of course, in art therapy, but also bibliotherapy, journaling, meditation, music, yoga, and guided visualization. And with that, I invite Jennifer Civita.
Thank you. I could give a very casual kind of a presentation. I don't have any visuals except for these pictures in front, so I'll explain what those are and why I brought them. But thank you, Ross, and yes, I am a fourth generation Chicagoan from the northwest side of the city. I also, with my grown children, they're fifth generation Chicagoans, so it's really a nice legacy that we're carrying on. I do have my Master of Arts in Counseling and Art Therapy from Adler University, and I have my PsyD, so my Doctor of Clinical Psychology from Adler as well. So I graduated a long time ago and have been out in the community and working, and it was very nice to come back. I was sometimes whenever I had a chance, I was an adjunct. And so it was a very nice thing then to end up coming back to Adler University here in Chicago. Part of the other things that I do, in addition to being a department chair, I am a consultant for 5 schools in the city that are underserved, and I work with the teachers as an advocate and the principal when they have no one else to kind of guide them through some of the critical issues that they face with children or lack of resources for families. I also have a private practice, which is called Civita Healthcare. And my background is, and I'll talk more on the panel, but I was the founder and executive director of the only City of Chicago-owned art and wellness center. It was called the West Portage Park Neighborhood Improvement Association and the Portage Park Center for the Arts. And I'll talk about that more in the panel, but I did that for 10 years as a non-for-profit. And so I'll go into that a little bit as well. I wanted to start with this great quote. I don't know if anyone has seen this book yet. Art in Chicago, A History from the Here to Now. And I was so happy to see, that there is each page features something new. And this one is a full page dedicated to Hull-House. And I just wanted to read just the last paragraph here, and it says, the brilliance of the Hull-House art program was the brilliance of Hull-House generally. The reformers lived their questions. What role did art play in social change? The question would never be answered with certainty, but they would try over and over to figure it out, always challenging themselves to think more critically and listen more carefully in the hopes that they would make the world better. And because of what they started, I said, we're all sitting in the same room, kind of doing the same thing. And if you read some of Jane Addams' books like I do to my students, the same issues that she's grappling with or working with are pretty much the same that we are. However, we just have to keep moving forward in doing that. So why did I bring these photos? And I will talk about that. They serve as an inspiration and kind of a visual reminder of my own personal legacy and the work that I do. So I'll explain who these women are. I probably should have had it up here, but that's okay. The roots of Adler University begin at the very foundation of Hull-House, and we've talked about Sarah Ellis Garland Dreikurs, so they called her Sadie, but then they also called her T. So I'm just going to call her Sadie. But Sadie Ellis Garland Dreikurs grew up at Hull-House, and we know that she met her husband, Leon Garland. Years later, Sadie met and started working with Rudolf Dreikurs, an internationally known Adlerian psychologist, then a resident at Hull-House, who offered open forum family counseling work with local parents at Hull-House. And he also worked at Morton East High School, which is in Cicero, and started a parenting program there in the 50s and 40s, I think, and 50s. It was very interesting. And it became so successful that the school decided they no longer needed parent resources and parenting forum, and disbanded it. Well, of course, nothing like that should ever be disbanded. And oddly enough, my brother works there now and says, wow, if we could have Rudolf Dreikurs back, or someone teaching parenting and giving resources for a lot of the parents, that would be really nice. As you know, Sadie and Rudolf married, and she helped Dreikurs in his writing and teaching obligations. So together, this is another aspect, an offshoot of Hull-House, is that they help create psychiatric clinics and conduct hospital staff orientations and worked at St. Joseph Hospital in creating programs. So Sadie started at St. Joseph's Hospital doing a lot of art therapy with patients. And along with the founders, Dr. Bernard Schulman and Dr. Harold Mozak, I credit Sadie because Sadie did a lot of her husband's work. I think she should be counted as a founder of what was then the Alfred Adler Institute of Chicago. Then it was the Adler School of Professional Psychology when I went there, and now, to 2015, they changed it to Adler University. It's now near, on Dearborn, kind of kitty corner from the Picasso. And a lot of people think it's a campus. It's not a campus. We're in a big office building, and we have two really big floors. I also want to note that oftentimes when I say I teach at Adler, people say, oh, I didn't know the planetarium had classes. So, I'm sure everyone in this room knows there's a difference between Alfred Adler and the Adler Planetarium. So as we know, in 1974, Sadie created the art therapy program. And her student, Judy Sutherland, later took Sadie's place at the helm and became the department chairperson of the Master of Arts in Counseling and Art Therapy program. Today, once a student, it's me, I was Dr. Judy Sutherland's student. So sadly, I had started at Adler about 2 years after Sadie had passed away. So I never got the chance to meet Sadie, but we have so many videos of Sadie Dreikurs and Dr. Judy Sutherland together. And Dr. Judy was going to come with me. We present together everywhere. And we did it at Northeastern University's 2 weeks ago at the Art in Response to Violence conference. And the notion that Dr. Judy Sutherland is like a direct, I always think like a direct descendant from Sadie, because Sadie taught her and kind of groomed her to do this. And then I think that Judy's, worked with me and taught me in the ways of Sadie. And so now I'm running the department, and I think that's a really neat opportunity. And we've now created the second in the United States PhD in art therapy program. And we can talk about more of that in the panel. But the notion that art therapy is really an important part of arts organizations, but also community development and revitalization. And as we know, right here, the arts is speaking to the city of Chicago. So Dr. Judy is now Professor Emerita. And I tell my students that they have to carry on the work and legacy of Jane Addams and Sadie and Dr. Judy Sutherland. And I said they have much work to do. I want to just talk briefly about why Hull-House legacy is significant in my own life. And I think it's interesting because the presenters this morning, we had this really big picture of what was going on. And I think, okay, I'm bringing it a little bit closer to home for us. So like Sadie, my grandmother, Tessie La Civita, but her maiden name was Finelli, was also born in 1900 in Chicago. And she and Sadie grew up taking art classes here at Hull-House. Although my grandmother's no longer alive, we all know that she was very fond of and greatly influenced by Jane Addams and her beloved Hull-House were all very respected within the Finelli family. My grandmother and her family lived right on Taylor Street. They owned Finelli Bakery and a shoe store, both on Taylor Street. And I think that has helped me kind of get an understanding and appreciation of what the history of Chicago brings, because my family is a part of that. I'm dedicated and honored to carry on the legacy of Jane Addams, and as the founder of the executive director from 1999 to 2010, the only city of Chicago owned Art and Wellness Center. It was a very large church that lost all its parishioners. And our alderman said, and I was very active in the arts in our community, and he said, we can't have a big building like this with an auditorium and a school attached, and to have that empty. So the parishioners left and merged with another church. And he said, why don't you come with me to City Hall and convince them that the city should buy this, because we're going to turn it into an arts center. And I think naively, I was, let's go do it. And I learned quite quickly how difficult that could be, which made me realize how hard Jane Addams had to work to make sure that funding continued to keep her buildings alive. Many older patrons likened it to a smaller version of Hull-House. It was a compliment indeed, since Jane Addams. Hull-House was essentially the model I used to revitalize and enhance the Northwest Side community, because I grew up listening to the stories about Taylor Street and Hull-House and the importance of dedicating oneself to improving the lives of those in the neighborhood. So my childhood and of course adulthood, visits to the area, including Hull-House Museum, deeply impacted and increased my love for Chicago, and it actually feels very much like home to me. Many years ago, my dissertation was about artists and urban revitalization, with the notion that, and as we see this, gentrification takes place once a neighborhood becomes kind of hip, and the very people who created it and made it and gave it the flavor that it had can no longer stay and live there. And so my premise was that no, when you create revitalization in a neighborhood, it's of and by and for the community, and that's how it stays. And oftentimes when I would have to go and meet with the city, they'd ask me what my membership fees were, what the dues were to be a member, why don't I increase prices? And I said, there are no members, this is of and for and by the very people who have what their needs were. And to turn a church into a music hall, it was very interesting. And so I'll say that for the panel, but it was a wonderful 10 years of my life to fill an auditorium, to fill a church, not only with opera music, but the garage band across the street who said, my mom and dad will help chaperone, can we play here? The notion that you're opening the doors to what people need, not what I thought the neighborhood needed or what I would like to see, but based on what people need and what they're looking for in their own neighborhood that normally it didn't exist. So I teach and work to create socially responsible communities in times of strife, transformation, restoration, rejuvenation, and self-others in the world. So essentially we talk about how socially responsible communities in the arts help foster peace. And one of my favorite words is Gemeinschaftsgefühl. And that was a German word Adler used for community feeling, social interest, and how it starts with the self, and that it's not about the self, it's about others, and it's about the world, and it's about starting at the neighborhood and working yourself through that. going back to a little bit with Sadie, and I'll explain my photos here. In 1974, the art therapy program was created and started by Sadie. And she started the use of art in group counseling with psychiatric patients at St. Joseph's Hospital. And then she was asked to teach the process and continue at Adler, which she did. And I wanted to quote her because I think this really resonates with now. She said, probably one of the most important influential events in my life was studying Adlerian psychology. Because it isn't just a psychology, it's a philosophy of life. And it changed me a great deal. It certainly made a more courageous person out of me. And we also think of Adlerian psychology as a non-pathological look at wellness. And it's very important in teaching that to our students, that you're going out to be an agent of change and to help communities. And not only provide services and leave, but to be socially embedded within the neighborhood and to help those who need help and to provide resources. But it's more important is that you're meeting their needs and you're not pathologizing and you're not overlooking the environment and the neighborhood and the community in which they come from. And with that, I want to talk about these pictures because this first one is of my grandmother. Again, born the same year as Sadie, and this is Sadie. So when I get overwhelmed as running one of the largest art therapy and counseling programs in the United States, I look at these pictures and think these are women who really worked hard to be innovative and to work in a neighborhood, but also to help it. And it's interesting because when my grandmother worked at the bakery, Al Capone was born around the same time too and lived right here and was a frequent customer at the bakery. And it's interesting because my family, the Italians, is buried in Mount Carmel and right next to the Capone family. And another historical interest is that my father always wanted to be a police officer, and my grandmother encouraged him to be part of the mafia. And when my father sat for the police exam, you go through your interviews, he was accepted, but she threw out the letter. So it was very interesting. But it prevailed because there are 5 generations of police officers in my family. And my son, who's a sergeant in the Marines, is also a Chicago police officer and works in Lawndale, and is a very young, energetic person who said, wow, we're trained a whole lot different than the other police officers now. And he said, I look at what I do and I call it community service. And I'm glad to see that things are, again, instilling change. And it begins with those people who are in the trenches, walking the streets and working with people, very much like Jane Addams did. Nobody sat in an ivory tower. And that's why I like Adlerian psychology. You are on the ground with everyone else, and you are equal to the people that you are helping. The other picture is of Dr. Sutherland and Sadie Dreikurs. And Dr. Sutherland, at the age of 80, is still traveling around the world, speaking all the good things about Jane Addams, and working through social justice and peace through the arts. And I think that is amazing. And I hope to do the same thing when I'm her age. I also would like to look like she does when she's 80. I always say, oh my gosh, Judy, how do you do this? The other person I have is my Polish grandmother. And she grew up on the South Side. And she worked at Marshall Fields as a teenager and probably into her early 20s. And why I bring up Marshall Fields is because if you read the book or the history of Marshall Fields, it was more than a department store. They offered, which I didn't know, almost like a daycare for mothers who wanted to shop or needed to get things and to bring their children. And there was a lot more to Marshall Fields than simply shopping. And again, she was born around the same time. And I just think being, again, socially embedded and from Chicago and working towards bringing improvements into the world. Even if you're working at Marshall Fields, I think you were still able to contribute and do good by doing that. And oddly enough, at the same time, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Emily Kimbrough, who was a writer along with Cornelius Otis Skinner, and they wrote Our Hearts Were Young and Gay, and it was made into a movie. But Emily Kimbrough was writing for what was called, and I always forget what it was called. It was Fashions of the Hour. She was a copywriter and worked at Marshall Fields, and she created this booklet. She later became the editor of the Ladies' Home Journal. And Emily Kimbrough was a member of the National Urban League and was very, very dedicated to making social change. And the interesting thing is that she worked there at the same time that my grandmother did. And I always said, from reading Emily's books, that if I ever had a daughter, I would name her Emily, after Emily Kimbrough. And again, just stepping stones into how this all fits into Jane Addams and community, was that you had this woman who was kind of ahead of her time as well, Emily Kimbrough. And when I was in college, I met someone named Brian Kimbrough, who actually was related to Emily Kimbrough. And long story, I ended up marrying him, and my daughter was born. And I said, not only does she have Emily's first name, she has Emily's last name. And so she too is carrying on the work of these great women, and in different ways. She's a veterinarian, so she works with animals instead of people, and that's still a really good thing. So I just think of how the blending of all of this goes in generation after generation, that we can still have hope and pass that on to our children. And I like to think that Jane Addams knows that this is carrying on, and to think that we're sitting in the very dining room where Sadie and Leon sat, and where major conversations about peace and the city took place. And I don't know if Jane Addams thought that this would continue and that we would all be here today celebrating her and carrying on her work. One of the things too is that I just wanted to talk a little bit about, it's almost, oh wait, I'm talking to I'm not going to talk until 2:30. Please don't email that. I'll finish in about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we can have some questions if you're interested. But the notion that, again, the mission of Adler University was founded on the mission of Jane Addams. So we carry on the same thing of community feeling courage, pluralism, excellence, pragmatism, and social change. And I think it's just a very interesting notion that we just graduated over 400 students on Sunday, and I think those are 400 agents of change steeped in social interest and the mind shifts that fuel the notion of making this world a better place by embedding yourself into communities and dedicating yourself to making things better, not for you, but for other people. Adlerian theory is considered by many to be a philosophy of peace that facilitates positive change within an individual, a family, a classroom, a neighborhood, a community in the world. He coined this in 1900s and translated to social interest or community feeling, and it relates to a person's kinship with other living beings and other living things. And I think he was an environmentalist before his time. And a sense of belonging in the human community, as opposed to one's private interests or concerns. Using it has a vast potential for engendering a more harmonious society and meaning in life. He was a world-renowned philosopher and psychiatrist, stressed the need to understand individuals within their social context. He began addressing the crucial and contemporary issues as equality, parent education, the influence of birth order, lifestyle, and the holism of individuals. Adler believed that we all have one basic desire, and that is the goal, to belong and to feel significant. Very much in keeping with the history of Jane Addams. A lot of what I was going to read is already, because I wrote it and it's on the wall upstairs, so I'm not going to read a little bit about it, because the exhibit, if you see cows can be purple up the stairs, there's a lot of information about it. So rather than repeat that again, I was like, oh, it's on the wall over there, that looks great. But I thought, oh, I have a little bit more to add. And then any kind of questions. But one of the things we talk about participatory arts and the legacy of Jane Addams, and there are ways of looking at, and I think it was happening here. Art is therapy, and there's a difference and art making is therapy, and art therapy is a profession. So when you think of art as therapy, It could be even looking at art and making art to improve or restore mental health and functioning in life. But it's also self-help, right? We can make art for ourselves and feel better because there's a natural therapeutic effect happening when you make art. And art making as a form of therapy is the same thing. And then art therapy, there's a difference, and that's a profession. And I'll talk about that in the panel, but the notion that it's a little different because it involves that element of sharing and telling your story, but also with the notion of how your story could either change or improve your life and growth, and there's a whole component of that. But I can just say that there are over 5,000 members of the American Art Therapy Association, and so I don't think people always realize, but every hospital and prison and social agency does have art therapists, and sometimes we're kind of quiet, a little bit in the background, because it's not always recognized and or sometimes acknowledged, but it does a whole lot of good, as many of you may know. And it is a mental health profession. And a goal in art therapy is to improve or restore a client's functioning and their sense of personal well-being. Art therapy practice requires knowledge of visual art, of course, and the creative process. And not all art therapy involves, you must have a pencil in your hand or a crayon or a marker. There's various forms, and even bibliotherapy or writing poetry is a form of expressive arts therapies. And it also instills a sense of inner peace, and I think that's what's really important. So today I'd kind of like you to make an intention. I think we can all be like Sadie, right? We can all carry on her legacy. We can all be a little bit like Jane Addams as well. And in the words of Alfred Adler, I really like this, that may we hear with the ears of another, may we see with the eyes of another, may we walk in the shoes of another, and may we feel the heart of another. I think that's how I'd like to end this. And I know there's extra time, but if you don't have questions, I just thought it's a beautiful day. You can go for a walk. Get some sunshine, which we so rarely get these days. I don't know, does anyone have any questions or thoughts or?
Mm-hmm. You know, your stories, where you tell it, it's your autobiography. I'm sorry. You're talking about your own story. You're talking in autobiographical terms. What I don't hear is where does art come from in you?
Oh, wow, that was interesting.
And how is that? I mean, clearly you're saying that you're coming from a tradition of helping others, and that's being something that's continuing on generationally. But your own path, and why art? I mean, you could have been a baker.
I could have in Finelli Bakery. You're right.
So where does art come from, and why does that speak to you in particular? And how do you see that vis-a-vis Hull-House?
Sure. I think art is so much a part of me that I often just forget to bring it up because, as my mom always said, your first friends were crayons. And again, in the neighborhood on the northwest side, I took the bus starting in 2nd grade by myself with a big portfolio to Estelle Fidel's Studio of Art. She wrote Art and You, a weekly column in the attic newspapers. And I took art lessons from 2nd grade until 8th grade. So I loved art, and art was a big part of our life. Museums and making art. We were 5 kids and the oldest of 5, and I needed sometimes to find my own peace living in a crowded house, and art was one of the ways that I did that. And when I was in high school, in addition to taking art at Good Counsel High School, I also went to the Art Institute and took art Saturdays. And I think making art in community is so important. And my undergrad, I was an art major and an English major, and I did my dissertation on the idea of literary depictions of artists in isolation. And the notion was that the more isolated someone was in making their art, it was more like the mental health of artists. And I focused on a number of them, that the more isolated you became, the more unhealthy you became, kind of almost engrossed in your own self, and sometimes with your own pathos and madness at times. And it's interesting then that I wrote my dissertation on the role of artists in urban revitalization and community, and the notion of making art together and having a sense of purpose and belief and belonging and being surrounded by other like-minded people who were working for the same thing kind of made you healthier. And that doesn't mean you always have to be surrounded by people, but the notion that being in community. And so I think I learned early on of making art sitting every Saturday with like 15 kids, and there was one woman who'd come back, you know, help you work while you were on your easel. And the idea of making art was amazing for me. And I never, you know, I remember I exhibited, but that wasn't my goal at all. But later on, I started working with Cornelia Arts Building on Ravenswood, and I was a member of that. And I've had over 40 one-woman shows throughout Chicago when I was in like my 20s and 20s. And I still make art, but I don't exhibit it or do anything like that. Sometimes I feel like Sadie, you know, she stopped making art, and I think, gosh, she shouldn't have done that. That's so not good. But I think of myself too, I'm so busy that my artwork can fill up, you know, a little journal, and I just make little doodles now at this point. But coming here and seeing art, of course, always inspires me. So the notion of that you have to walk the talk, right? You guys should be making more art, and that's on my intention list. But
To follow up, it's interesting because on the panel we had this morning, Fred was talking about, you know, how he didn't want us to hang out where all the other galleries were. He sort of was shunning the art's esteem.
yeah,
But there's a paradox to that, because to be sufficiently recognized as an artist means you have to have a certain kind of business, a certain kind of status,
True.
stamp of approval, you're doing excellence. But that ultimately it's not the artistic goal that matters
No.
to you and him,
no.
but rather this sort of larger
A larger
service
story.
community thing.
And community arts, I was never, you know, like, oh, my goal is to be in some gallery. You know, like, I was more ingrained, and I think so as he is, in the community. And that arts group, we used to have art salons at the center, and it was bring your artwork, and we had exhibits as well. It was all local people. Nobody was charged. You know, so I think the idea that my goal was not to be, you know, somewhere in an arts district, but it was more to be within the neighborhood and to highlight people who were in the neighborhood. Highlight the moms and dads who were baseball coaches and busy with children, but they can bring the art piece that they made on a Saturday afternoon to the center, and we can all sit around and talk about it, and then exhibit their artwork. So to me, that's what art, being in the art scene, was to me, as opposed to being on, some big white walls. And I think too, you know, I learned early on that it was about your neighborhood and community. So my father was a social worker at Miralac House, which was in Garfield Park area years ago. I think it might exist in a very small area, but he was working as a social worker before he was drafted, before the start of the Vietnam War. And that idea of giving and being a part of something other than your own personal gain was a really important thing within my family. And my mother's a nurse, and she's 76 years old and is still working as a nurse in Chicago. And I think that also instilled in all of us the idea of giving yourself, whether medical or art or, you know, whatever the case. And she, every year for 30 years, she went to South America in Cali, Colombia, and helped assist with children's surgeries at a hospital. And I think of that giving, and leaving your 5 kids with your husband to go help others less fortunate, influenced us as well. So again, I always think like that legacy of Jane Addams. And Jane Addams was a household name in our house too, because my grandmother had always talked about what a nice lady she was and how important that was for the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm curious how the art therapy program evolved out of the Adlerian philosophy. What's the roots of it? Is there any science to it? Is there any theory to it? And how came the art?
Well, and Rudolf Dreikurs was an Adlerian and worked with Adler before he came here to the United States. And so Rudolf Dreikurs, with his interest here at Hull-House and then being with Sadie, he kind of imparted a lot of that theory and philosophy to her. And then when they founded Adler it was dedicated to his, we call it more a philosophy, a way of living, a lens. He also studied ophthalmology, and it was like a lens of looking out onto the world and how they looked at it. And it's very identical to the way Jane Addams looked at it as well. That kind of, and Adler University is we work with marginalized, oppressed populations, so our students are all in areas that are in great need of additional resources and in whatever way possible. They have a social justice practicum they have to do in addition to their clinical hours, so they end up with almost 1,000 hours in 2 years. It's a really grueling program, I can tell you, but we graduate really good students, and it is good. So it's that philosophy of carrying on, and I think Adler, people took a lot of things that they liked from one another, and Carl Rogers went to a lecture by Harold Mosaic on Adler, and then suddenly he came up with the humanistic theories. I mean, everybody borrowed and took from each other, and I think Dreikurs took a lot from Jane Addams.
So we've named a lot of our programs related to the participatory arts art therapy section after House Can Be Purple, inspired by Sadie's autobiography or book. Can you just share that story from the Cows Can Be Purple that she tells?
Oh, the story about it.
Why, what is it about cows and
Purple. So here's an interesting thing, is that, and I have to get the film to you, one of our graduates, this was right shortly before Sadie passed away, interviewed her, and it's like 5 hours of, and it's been edited, but 5 hours of Sadie just talking about her whole life. And the interesting thing is, I'm like, God, this color is just so predominant. Sadie wears a dress the same color, and I thought, oh gosh, too bad we didn't show it. It's like this, the other art and design kind of thing. But so Sadie tells the story of how she was in grade school, and the teacher said to draw a cow and to color it. So she made a cow and colored it purple. And the teacher ripped it up and told her, you do it again, and cows are not purple. And she said, but I can make my cow purple. So there was a whole litany of going back and forth, and Sadie tells the story of her mother had to come to school because her daughter was like not listening to what the teacher was doing. So that became the theme, kind of like cows can be purple. And so the cover of the book, actually, Judy Sutherland drew the outline of the book. And it's a very simple, and this is one thing that I really like, how Sadie and her husband, Rudolph, and Adler did not write in psychobabble. They wrote in very basic terms that anyone could understand. And that's part of the philosophy, is that we are not the therapists and the authority. We are equal because we're both on the same path of life here, and I'm helping you and you're helping me grow. So the notion that when we say cows can be purple is sort of like that idea, I think metaphorically, of think outside of the box and look beyond what you see, because there's more to it. Sadie tells the story much more dramatically about how she stood her ground with this teacher at such a young age. And she likens that to because she was a middle child. And she also talks about how she thought she was ugly. Personally, I always thought she was very beautiful, very striking. And she said, I was that ugly middle kid, and my sister was just, this Blanche was beautiful, and then she had a brother. So she had to find her way in the world and create her own sense of who she was. And she said when she was born, like, family came over, and her sister tells her the story, they ran away from you because you were such an ugly baby. And so she grew up kind of having that idea of, I'm not good enough. And Rudolf Dreikurs, we always say this at Adler, but coined the term, like, have the courage to be imperfect. It's okay. You can't do everything perfect or right, but you have the courage to be imperfect. And so she often, in her films, talks about, it's okay that I wasn't the best looking, because in her eyes, I wasn't the best looking, so I came up with my own way to be the best that I could. And she had that undercurrent of, I have a middle child, and I have to carve out my niche and I'm going to do it well. And she certainly did.
So I've been interested in how the pedagogy in Hull-House in the different parts of
A little bit louder.
I've been interested in the development of a cultural pedagogy, how to approach teaching art, music, drama, and so forth, and have looked at what the students who participated said about their mentors, their teachers, their experiences, and what the theorizing at the time was by, people like Addams, who, was talking to people like John Dewey, and certainly was, Eleanor Smith, for example, had studied with Francis Parker, what becomes the Francis Parker School, and had progressive education ideas. She was very influenced by Freud, who had ideas about the relationship of art and certainly music to moral development. So, and I have, sort of come to a conclusion myself about the relationship of art and moral character building that seemed to play a big role in Hull-House. And then I see the evolution of something that you're talking about, which is much more relativistic, and it's sort of going sort of away from that. And I'm just, could you comment, because a lot of the people who went through the theater program and so forth and so on remarked about how diction, elocution, vocabulary, and that there was a structure there that was imposed, that people really, that was very, very important. And even to the fact that when you came into Hull-House, boys were to take their hats off, and there was a sort of level of behavior that was sort of imposed within the place. And so I'm interested in, sort of your thoughts about that, and when and how that may have, what Rudolf Dreikurs, because he was there, I guess he overlapped with Addams. Okay, just barely.
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind too is that, when you look at if Jane Addams were alive today, how would some of her thinking evolve? How would it be different? And if Adler was alive today, what are some of the things that he would talk about or change about some of the things that he thought? Because of course, at that time, homosexuality was a neurosis. And what is that like, and what would he say now? And actually, I guess something that resonated in me when you were talking was the fact that he was like a social democrat. So he was, and his wife was a communist. And so how did they balance this notion of two people with different ideas? But he was also about equality and really was ahead of his time when it came to women's rights. Raisa was arrested many times. I don't think I'm answering your question, but I guess those things were coming to my head, where one of his daughters was a very outspoken communist with Trotsky, and she was killed in
Well, they were very progressive people.
They were very progressive.
I think that Addams was probably much more able to accept, they were the only communists in the house.
Right.
Right, and that sort of thing. But this issue, another way I'm trying to get at, I think that we have to be careful about the assumptions we make about what Addams was like and what we're doing today. I think that there are, and maybe that's my
True, but I mean, Sadie
My
talked a lot
experience-
about how
right.
Jane Addams was to her.
Right, that I think that there was something very specific about what happened here as well as universal. You know, it talks to us, but it also talks to us out of the specificity. And that we have to be mindful of it as we see change over time.
Sure.
And I think that we think about art rather differently. I think that there was a generally eclectic, non-judgmental philosophy, but one of the things that Anella Benedict, for example, really prided herself on was that there was live drawing classes every single week at Hull-House, where at an inexpensive cost, with live, you know, with real people modeling, and that it was one of the few places in Chicago where that was, where it was possible to learn classical drawing and so forth and so on, and that was something that she pushed to maintain over the years, because I think they had an idea about what constituted training.
Sure.
And that was really part of it, and it was related to this kind of ethical, moral hang-up they had. I mean, I think they were Victorian.
I don't think they wanted the kids to become obedient. They wanted them to be trained
In some,
on a semi-professional level.
so maybe since when you think of Sadie, who did not like the idea of being boxed in and draw your cow brown,
She may have been rebelling against it.
she rebelled, and I also think art therapy is certainly not about the product at all. It is about the process. So, and we teach, you know, it isn't about how it looks. It's about the steps you took and why you created what you did and how it made you feel, and if you could change it, what would you do? So Sadie certainly brought a different thing, and she did go to the Art Institute. She didn't graduate. I don't think because she couldn't afford to pay the tuition, but so she probably got her foundation there, but I think she kind of bucked that system, and that's where she found her niche within art therapy, because art therapy is very loose. We don't judge people on how something looks, and when we sit together and process someone's work, it's not about how it looked at all. It's what that person says about it, and it's not my interpretation of it at all. If anything, it's your understanding of what how they're interpreting it.
But, and I don't mean by the challenging way.
Oh, no,
Like
it's
what you're talking about.
Yes.
You know, there's a really fascinating thing. I get to the court of so much of this. It has to do with what I may consider norms. And the norms are defined as being healthy, let's say, whether they're psychological or cultural or behavioral, on one hand. And then right next to it, let's say, has something to do with individual freedom, self-expression, and health. And in your field, and I don't know your field, so forgive me, so it's a question. But you know, I mean, you say to someone, whatever you think and want to believe is true, because you think, gee, that's going to be good for them because you're strengthening their sense of self, their ego, self-worth, let's say. But what you could be also encouraging is something could also be, in a larger sense, destructive to them, perhaps.
Sure.
Because it's not part of the norms that they may need to survive.
Right, and everyone.
So how, and we can talk about it in terms of race, and we can talk about it in terms of ethnicity, and we can talk about it in terms of basic socialization, we can talk about it in terms of gender and sexual identity. But it's always really the same thing. And that's kind of what the dilemma is that the Addams explored, because they somehow managed to balance. Yeah, guys, learn enough so that you can fit into this larger world beyond the neighborhood, so you can transcend the neighborhood, and yet at the same time feel good about yourself. But you know, you push it a little bit this way, it can be called racist, or it can be called reformist, or it can be called conservative. You push it a little bit this way, and it can be called deviance, or, you know what I'm saying? It's like, how do you guys, in your practice, maybe is that fair in terms of what you're, I don't know.
Well, I can say that Alfred Adler, with his philosophy, was that we all have our own private logic, and sometimes it's faulty. And at one point it worked. We all have our own truths, and at one point maybe they worked. But at some point, they become almost like your basic mistakes, and there's mistaken goals of behavior. So a therapist would start to work with a client about what's their private logic based on all these other factors. And why are they seeing me? And they're seeing me because what worked for them when they were 5 it no longer works for them when they're 20. So how can we change some of those basic, Dreikurs is basically mistakes. But the idea that you are, so Alfred Adler did not like to pathologize. So yes, there are people, obviously, we know, that do have a diagnosis, but that he always looked at it as a different idea, that it could be cultural, it could be ethnicity, it could be religion, it could be whatever it is. Let's sit and talk about it, and no one has the same story as anybody else. So even if you're talking to someone, say, from Cambodia, and you see another client from Cambodia, well, their story and their story are completely two different things when you start making those generalizations. So it's very much about your own truths and talking to them, but it's also seeing through their eyes what's not working for them and how you can help them. But it isn't from the point of, as I say to my clients, we are on this journey together, and you hold all the answers, but you don't know them right now, and neither do I. So we are here together. It's almost like pulling a string. You've got it, but we just have to figure this out so that you can, be the best you that you want to be within your community, your life, whatever it is. Well, we're out of time.